Hey, I'm Duke on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and GreenSunsZenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store where you can buy singles through TCG Player or CardHoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it. Hey, a huge thank you to my current patrons who support my content and are the ones to thank for keeping mid-roll ads off my videos. It's really humbling to be supported by other players from all around the world. I absolutely love being a member of the Maverick and wider Legacy community, and it's a real privilege to have the voice I currently have within it. If you want to join the Zenith or support me in other ways, check out the video description on how to go about that. Alright, let's do this. Hey, welcome back to another version of A Maverick's Perspective. This is, I believe, the third edition. This one's focusing on artifact and enchantment interaction through creatures, and currently what's being played and probably what is best suited for today's metagame. So since the birth of Maverick by Luis Viciano, artifact and enchantment hate has been a pretty big staple of Maverick. In the first list, obviously without GreenSunsZenith, Kusali Pridemage was a 4 of, a card that saw play in Maverick for a long time, and only recently, in the last few years, has fallen out of favor for other versions of it and other artifact and enchantment hate. But the more I think about Kusali Pridemage, the less I am all about throwing it fully off the table, because there are some situations where Kusali Pridemage is better. Obviously, since the printing of GreenSunsZenith, the ability to drop Kusali Pridemage to a 1 of and have 5 virtual copies thanks to GreenSunsZenith has been pretty great and has changed the deck from what it was first born as. We have multiple choices these days and not just Kusali Pridemage, but it does give you a good idea of potentially why you don't see white-based artifact or enchantment hate in creatures, and yeah, it just shows the flexibility that GreenSunsZenith gives you. So currently, looking at the top 16 decks, there's only 4 that I probably wouldn't want to have artifact or enchantment hate in the main deck for. Obviously, Collector Oof makes this a little bit different, say against Doomsday, where they're running Lotus Petals and Lion's Eye Diamonds. It's not really needed, but there are a few decks around where I do want to have some sort of artifact or enchantment hate. Rhinos was the one that was kind of an outlier. Potentially game 2 and 3, where they sometimes side into Blood Moon, I would like to have it, but game 1 it doesn't do a whole lot. Reanimator up the top is most likely just blue-black scam, where Animate Dead is in the mix, and typically I do like having an Animate Dead removal spell through GreenSunsZenith, because it is just another way to deal with something like a troll or a grief. So obviously the 2 cards that I think have got the most amount of play over the past few years have been Outland Liberator, a kind of upgraded version of Kusali Pridemage, and Knight of Autumn, also known as Swiss Army Knight, because of the abilities it has on ETBs. It gives you a number of options to suit different scenarios. Liberator has the bonus effect of turning into a Trigon Predator, per se, so whenever it attacks, you get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So it doesn't need to deal damage, which is fantastic, especially against a deck like Maze of Ith in lands that can come up a lot, or potentially even wanting to deal with an artifact or enchantment creature that could block it. Liberator is pretty cool. So one advantage that Knight of Autumn has over the other 2 in Kusali Pridemage and Outland Liberator is that it leaves behind a body, which typically leads to a 2-for-1. You're able to deal with an artifact or enchantment, and then your opponent down the line has to remove the Knight of Autumn at some stage. It also being a body works really well with cards like Fiend Artisan, Grist, and Minskenboo to give you another way to use Knight. So obviously the body could be traded for something else. It could be removed to deal with a opposing creature through Grist, or just trade it in for dealing damage to finish off an opponent, finish off a creature, or just keep applying damage. So the body of Knight is definitely a pretty big bonus in builds of Maverick these days. The other one that I want to shout out is Haywire Might, which is typically played in the Urza Saga versions of Maverick because it's obviously tutorable. It is only 1 mana and 1 mana to activate, so a lot cheaper than the other versions that are typically 3 mana, either 2 to cast and 1 to activate or 3 to cast. And Haywire Might does deal with some pretty pesky threats. So Cauldron Complete is obviously an indestructible artifact that can be pretty hard to deal with if you don't have Haywire Might, because although Swords to Plowshares deals with the creature, decks that run Cauldron, typically Death and Taxes, do run abilities that flicker Cauldron, like Flicker Wisp, like Yorion. So Swords to Plowshares is only kind of a band-aid most of the time. Welder decks as well that run things like Goblin Welder, it's really good to have an ability that actually exiles the threat. You can't target creatures, which is a pretty big setback against Painter, but being able to exile against Goblin Welder is really nice. So speaking of that, there are a few things, especially out of Painter, that Haywire Might doesn't deal with. Phyrexian Dragon Engine, Chaos Defiler, Painter's Servant, and of course Constructs. Blood Moon and Chalice are also cards that I wouldn't say are particularly targeted towards beating Maverick style decks, but they can be a pretty big bump in the road for how we usually play out our games. Chalice turning off mana acceleration and also access to colored mana through creatures works really well when paired with Blood Moon. Blood Moon obviously means Saga is not an option, and therefore getting Haywire Might off Saga under a Blood Moon and a Chalice, which does come up, is a no-go. Haywire Might obviously being countered by the Chalice if you're trying to cast it, which is pretty brutal. So there's definitely some downsides to Haywire Might as well, where cards like Outland Liberator shine, especially against Blood Moon, because it does only cost 1 green. And 1 green is typically, through a forest, the way to go against Blood Moon decks. The forest gives you access not only to Outland Liberator, but to GreenSunsZenith to allow you to get maybe some mana dorks into play, or get a big threat into play. So usually if a Blood Moon does come into play and you have a fetch, you usually fetch for that basic forest, which gives you access to Liberator. Qasali Pridemage and Knight of Autumn, both needing green and white, a lot harder to find with a Blood Moon. Typically you'll need to find the forest and then find the white source off a GreenSunsZenith before you find the plains, if you are running a plains. Collector Oof is another thing. So Collector Oof, since its printing, has really taken a lot of pressure off Maverick against a lot of the sort of storm-based combo decks, shutting off things like LED and Lotus Petal, Wishclaw Talisman in the older versions, against 8 casts, which is now kind of seen as Patchwork Stompy. Obviously turns off a large amount of their deck, including their lands in artifact lands like Seed of the Synod. But the issue with Oof is that recently we've seen cards like Beseech the Mirror, Kappa Cannoneer, and of course Urza Saga Constructs just give opponents another out to Oof, in that if you have Collector Oof against Storm on turn 2, they can still, ramp into Beseech off cards like Dark Ritual and get rid of that artifact to then use the bargain effect. Constructs as well. Constructs are only going to get bigger when Oof is in play, because your opponent can still cast the artifacts and grow the construct, which a lot of times, sadly, against 8 cast, I've played the turn 2 Oof, but they've had the Saga in play with something like Ancient Tomb, played a bunch of artifacts, and I've had to end up just getting in front of the construct with my Collector Oof and chumping, which isn't great. Kappa Cannoneer, and I should have Patchwork in this as well. Patchwork as well has really shown where the deck is moving towards in a really aggressive route. And yeah, Collector Oof there as well. Although it does have it does constrict their ability to go wide. Cards like Kappa and Patchwork don't really need that. And in the end, you are going to probably end up chumping it if you don't have other disruption like Outland Liberator. So yeah, I would say for those of you who might be thinking, hey, you have Collector Oof, why are you running Artifact and Enchantment Head as well? Is there really a need for it? There are definitely situations where Collector Oof just isn't enough in game one. And you do want to have that ongoing pressure, that ongoing disruption, whether that's through Atlan Liberator, whether that's through something like Gaddock Teague as well against the Storm decks. Oof these days by itself, although great, is kind of, yeah, just not enough. So something to note. Rampaging Yao Guai, hopefully I predicted that right, is a card from Fallout, which is triple green. So if you green suns for it, it comes into play with no counters on it. But when it comes into play, it destroys any number of target artifacts and or enchantments with total mana value X or less. So if you green suns for this, it's going to deal with all the 0 mana artifacts and enchantments, which you can see here. So off the bat, pretty strong. If you have a metagame where you have decks like Patchwork, where you have lands, Rampaging is a pretty sweet card. I probably wouldn't say it's a great main deck card, because in the main deck, you kind of want something like Liberator where you're going to be targeting exactly what you want to deal with. But as the sideboard grows towards Force of Vigor number 3 for a lot of players, I think this could be a great slot filler for the third Force of Vigor as just another way to attack your opponent's artifacts or enchantments. Typically against the decks where it's great, it will be at least a 2-for-1, if not more. And it does just give you a nice way to not 1-for-1 your opponent. Maverick's filled with 1-for-1s in the case of Wasteland, Swords to Plowshares. Orcish Bowmaster is kind of one of the newer 2-for-1s. Force of Vigor does give you access to a 2-for-1 if you cast it. Obviously, if you don't, it's a 2-for-2. But yeah, I think this card is a little bit tough on mana. 3 green is not that easy to get to with Mav. You probably need to have a mana dork straight up, and then every land you play, like a Plains or a Karakas or a Wasteland, is 1 turn off actually getting to cast this. Obviously, that mana can go towards the X, but yeah, triple green is pretty tough, and you don't always get to that, especially against the Blood Moon decks. It's going to be near impossible with cards like Fury taking out your mana dorks as well. So sadly, this card isn't on MTGO. Fallout isn't coming to the online metagame, but I think in paper we'll see this card from time to time in sideboards. It's a pretty cool card. Cankerbloom. So Cankerbloom is another card that came out in a Phyrexian set. It has 2 mana, same as Outland Liberator, so 1 and a green. It's a 3/2, so it's actually a little bit better on the front. And then for 1 mana, you can sacrifice it to either destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or proliferate. Proliferate, a little bit awkward because currently in Legacy there aren't too many things that you want to do. Against the Chalice decks that played turn 1 Chalice for 1, putting the Chalice to 2 is probably still going to impact you, but not impact your opponents that much. A lot of the Chalice decks are running a lot of 0 mana artifact ramp, and then a lot of 3-drops. Not too many 2-drops. If you ask me what, say, Mono Red Stompy was playing right now in the 2-drop slot, I would be saying Chalice for 1. Potentially Stomp, if some versions are still playing Bone Crusher Giant, but otherwise a lot of 3-drops come to mind. So not too sure where the Chalice hits. Even something like Patchwork, I guess it does stop Patchworks coming down if you do, turn a Chalice for 1 into a Chalice for 2, but honestly not the greatest. Vial as well, not too great. I do believe that if your opponent activates Vial, say on 3, and you proliferate it to 4, your opponent then can only put in a creature with 4 CMC, but let me know in the comments if that's correct. The only real thing I see it working as if your opponent doesn't have an artifact or enchantment you want to deal with, and you have a Grist in play, potentially you can grow that Grist up a little bit, which is kind of nice. It also has a decent body, like a 3/2 for 2 isn't too bad, but again, when it's up against Outland Liberator in terms of cost, the ongoing value that Liberator can provide just far outweighs the ability to potentially proliferate. A few things to note here as well is that Pithing Needle is played in Legacy, and it is a card played alongside Urza's Saga. There are a few cards that I have mentioned that are actually hit by Pithing Needle. So, Crystallic Pridemage, Kenkelbloom, Haywire Might, although cards you probably wouldn't want to name with Needle against Mav, it's definitely there for your opponent. I didn't put Outland Liberator here because although your opponent can Needle Outland Liberator, once it flips, it then is no longer affected by Pithing Needle because it has a whole new name, which is pretty cool. So just one small thing to note about these cards. Blood Moon. So Blood Moon is a tough one, and probably the card that I just find the most annoying in terms of building out my board state. So having easier ways to cast easier answers with more. Let's think. We won't cut this out. Yeah. Outland Liberator is obviously easier to cast through Blood Moon than, say, Crystallic Pridemage or Knight of Autumn. Haywire Might on the same turns, but one thing about Haywire Might is that typically you want to find it through Saga. So the Blood Moon turning off Saga is pretty huge. It leaves you with a answer that's a one-of in your deck that you have to naturally draw into, whereas obviously Liberator you can Green Suns for. So I typically find in Blood Moon metas, I much rather the Liberator because it's just, easy to cast. And usually a card against Blood Moon decks that I just want to tutor for pretty aggressively anyway. Up the Beanstalk's an interesting one because Up the Beanstalk replaces itself straight away. So if you trade for the Beanstalk 1-for-1, you're actually down a card, which kind of sucks. So typically the best way that I find to deal with Up the Beanstalk is either through, obviously, a card like Spirit of the Labyrinth, which hasn't seen too much play thanks to Orcish Bowmaster. Bowmaster isn't too bad either, as it does just keep applying pressure to your Up the Beanstalk opponent. But if you want to get off the field, being able to deal with it through the activated ability, or the triggered ability, I should say, of Frenzied Trapbreaker is really good from a value perspective. Knight of Autumn as well isn't too bad because you're able to deal with the Beanstalk, and then they probably have to deal with the Knight in another fashion. So Frenzied here against lands style decks is probably where it's at its best, I find. Being able to deal with anything from Exploration to Mox Diamond to Saga is really good. And if your opponent has access to Punishing Fire or Swords to Plowshares, typically I try to be a little bit patient with making sure I have the mana open to use it if I am going for Outland Liberator, just so I don't obviously lose it without getting the value there. Animate Dead is a card that pops up. It's obviously in Scam and a few other versions of the Troll style decks, but I do like having Liberator in the deck for Animate Dead. One very key rule to know is that if Animate Dead isn't on the battlefield as its triggered ability resolves, none of its effects happen. The creature card won't be returned to the battlefield. So this means if I have Liberator in play, my opponent plays Animate Dead, targeting Troll, I can then deal with the Animate Dead before the Troll actually comes into play and therefore doesn't come into play, which is pretty sweet. So against even the older style Reanimator decks, very weird that I'm saying older style, but honestly I haven't seen Reanimator in a long time since this blue-black Scam Inator deck has come around. I usually keep Liberator in just because it is a nice answer to Animate Dead. Show and Tell hasn't seen too much play, but this is always kind of a talking point of artifact and enchantment hate in Maverick and kind of what is the best to play. If your opponent casts Show and Tell and they put in Omniscience, typically I would rather have Knight of Autumn, as it allows you to gain priority with the trigger and deal with the Omniscience before they can cast a sorcery speed spell. So if they have the Cunning Wish line, they can just win in response, which is pretty tough, but Liberator is pretty similar. If you play Outland Liberator and they have the Cunning Wish line, they typically want to either cast another instant speed or sorcery speed spell and then make you Liberator in response. Or if you, for some reason, maybe like through Surgical, you might know their hand, you can try to keep Liberator and then sort of interact when you might have something else. You might be able to untap and play a Thalia to stop them from casting something for free, and then Liberator, the Omniscience. But obviously, I find a lot of the time Omniscience just goes into either Emrakul or Atraxa, which is sorcery speed play, and therefore Knight of Autumn I think is really good. Sneak attack off Show and Tell. Typically, your opponent will play out the Lotus Petal or have the red mana open before they Show and Tell, so you can't respond to, say, the Lotus Petal by dealing with the sneak attack. Just, yeah, a really awkward time at points, because if your opponent is a real heads-up player, they might just put in the Atraxa or the Emrakul off the Omniscience if they kind of snuff out that you have a Knight of Autumn. Pick Your Poison. So Pick Your Poison's coming up as a sideboard card. I know some players are trying it out in different decks in Legacy, and the main deck is kind of a 1 or 2 of. I find it really interesting, because I find historically, cards that give your opponents the choice aren't that great. And the example that I always go to is Vexing Devil, which is, I believe, for 1 red mana, a 4/3 creature. And when it comes into play, your opponent can either take 4 damage, or they can just allow you to have the Vexing Devil. So this gives your opponent the choice. So this means that if your opponent is at a high enough life total and is happy to pay the 4, they'll take the 4. If they have, say, Fatal Push or Bolt in hand, they'll probably just let you have the creature and then remove it. Pick Your Poison is it's versatile. It is versatile, but it does give your opponent the option. So say if you have Pick Your Poison in your sideboard over something like an additional copy of Force of Vigor or a Path to Exile, it's not going to deal with the target that you want it to deal with all the time. And I have some examples here where you might have it against the Patchwork Stompy deck or an 8-cast deck, and you want to deal with a Kappa Cannoneer or a Patchwork Automaton, and they just have a Seat of the Synod there, and they can sacrifice that instead. You might want to deal with a Murktide, but they have a Flip Delver or a 3/3 DRC. You might want to deal with an Exploration, but they have an Urza's Saga, and they have a Loam online. It can definitely backfire where it doesn't deal with what you want. It typically is very mana efficient, being able to Pick Your Poison a Murktide or a Kappa or something of that nature is really nice, and I can see the appeal of it, but I haven't been trying it out myself, because I find that typically on decks like Maverick, you don't have the luxury of giving your opponent a choice. You really want to make sure that what you're hitting is what you care about. I wouldn't like to have this against a Ensnaring Bridge board state where your opponent has another artifact to sacrifice. That'd be pretty tough, because that is just a card that I want to remove, and I want to keep obviously applying damage. So Pick Your Poison is a pretty interesting one. You might have other removal that lines up well with it, and allows you to kind of maybe Punishing Fire the Insect Elaboration, and then cast this to get rid of the Murktide. But I think, yeah, just be wary of it, because there are going to be situations where you deal with a card that you probably didn't really want to deal with, but you did get it off the board and make a 1-for-1 trade. So not all is bad. These are just some cards that I find come in, mainly the first two, with decks like Delver, where you typically take out your Artifact and Enchantment Hate, but games 2 and 3, they might have something like a Grafdigger's Cage or an Unlicensed Hearse, or Goblins used to play Relic. Animate Dead out of some decks, where you really have to sum up, is it worth having, say, Outland Liberator still in the deck just to potentially deal with these cards in the sideboard? I typically find no. I didn't mind when I was testing out cards like Prismatic Ending, which is pretty decent against Delver and also hits a lot of these cards, if not all of them, which is great. But over time, Prismatic has kind of just been a little bit too flexible, that it's a Jotmon. It's kind of like a Jack of all trades, but a master of none. So I'd much rather just have a tutable creature that can deal with something, rather than relying on drawing, a spell that I can't tutor for. But yeah, I think it's always interesting to keep an eye on how players are boarding. Is Grafdigger's Cage becoming a staple in sideboards? Is Unlicensed Hearse becoming a staple in sideboards? If they, if you play against Delver 5 times, and 5 times in games 2 and 3 they've had these cards, maybe it's worth changing things up and saying, hey, let's potentially play Knight of Autumn, because If they have the early cage, we have an answer. If they have the unlicensed earth, we have an answer. If not, we can potentially gain some life, make a 4/3. Maybe you want that over something like Outland Liberator that is a little bit more niche, but yeah, just a thought. So what I did here was just look at some of the last few Maverick decks that have done pretty well in terms of performances, and just which cards they're playing in the main deck. So here we have a 8th place challenge with Liberator in the main deck, and then we actually have 4 Force of Vigor in the sideboard, which is pretty brutal. So yeah, good luck Artifact and Enchantment opponents. Harry here, a very prominent Maverick player. Liberator, Outland Liberator main deck, sideboard 2 Force of Vigors, 2 Pick Your Poison as well. So there you go, which is really cool to see. Harry again, and I believe the same player from the 8th place challenge finish. Liberator, sideboard, Pick Your Poison, Force, sideboard, Force. There was one player here, Liberator. Here we go, by Stress Steady. Also playing Haywire Might, but also playing Liberator, just having 2 effects. Obviously, both have their advantages and disadvantages, but yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that right now, Outland Liberator is kind of the winner. So I think just the value it gives you against the decks that it's good against is exactly what Maverick wants. It allows you to get those 2-for-1s, maybe 3-for-1s, maybe even more. And isn't too hard to turn on. Lands typically has, 4 Mox, 4 Exploration, 4 Loam, 4 Crop Rotation, potentially 4 Spheres in the main decks. That's 20 spells. A lot of the hands they keep will include 1, if not 2 of those spells. So by the time Liberator's online or on the table, your opponent might not actually have any spells to cast. They might just have a bunch of lands and they're trying to play more lands. So Liberator against lands does flip quite well. Against some of the 8-cast Patchwork Stompy decks, you might have to kind of take a turn or hold up instant speed interaction to flip your own Liberator. But obviously those decks also have a pretty easy time casting 2 spells in a turn to flip it back. So be wary of that. But hey, I hope you enjoyed this sort of content. Just a quick run through around some of the different artifact and enchantment removal effects that you can have through creatures within Maverick. And yeah, I think where we are currently with Outland Liberator is a really good spot. It's also a human, which isn't the only thing I was going to mention about human, and where Outland Liberator is a little bit worse against Qasali Pridemage is against Plague Engineer. Typically naming human against Maverick, Liberator can't attack into a Plague Engineer. It'll be a 1/1 into a 2/2, but a Qasali Pridemage, even if it was named, say Cat, it can attack with Exalted as a 2/2 into Plague Engineer. So a really niche situation, but just one small thing. Thanks for stopping by. We'll catch you next time.